How has your day been so far? Hello, we're AETA Stories, and today we're sharing a brand new original story with you.
Lily Carter had always been the kind of young woman people noticed, without quite knowing why. It wasn't only her looks, though those were undeniable, but the ease with which she moved through rooms and conversations, the warmth she carried with her like a quiet light. Raised in a comfortable Boston household, Lily grew up surrounded by stability, expectations, and a clear picture of what her future was supposed to look like. Her parents, Evelyn and Richard Carter, had worked hard for everything they owned, and they believed deeply in order, planning, and sensible choices. Lily, their only daughter, was meant to be the natural continuation of that careful life. On that particular evening, the family sat together in the dining room of their townhouse. The air still and polite in the way it often was before something important was said. Lily's hands trembled slightly as she rested them on the edge of the table. She had rehearsed the words in her mind countless times, but now that the moment had arrived, they felt heavier than expected. She told them simply and clearly that she was in love, that she and Dan Carter, had been together for some time, and that they intended to get married. For a brief second, silence settled over the room, thick and disbelieving. Evelyn was the first to react. Her smile froze, then disappeared altogether, replaced by a tight, uneasy expression. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying his daughter as if she had just spoken a foreign language. Evelyn asked whether Lily was joking. When Lily shook her head, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart, the questions turned sharp. Too sharp. How long had this been going on? What exactly did Lily think she was doing? Richard joined in more quietly, but no less firmly, his disappointment evident in the way his jaw tightened. They spoke of Dan as though he were a problem to be solved rather than a man Lily loved. He had no money, they reminded her, no parents, no established family, no safety net, no visible future. Richard asked what Lily truly knew about someone who came from nothing. Evelyn went further, voicing fears about instability, hardship, and regret. Love, she said, was not enough to build a life. At first, Lily tried to explain calmly. Dan was kind. Dan was honest. Dan worked hard and treated her with respect. But every sentence she offered seemed to deepen the divide between them. Her parents heard only risk and loss where she saw devotion and sincerity. Then Richard mentioned Andrew Whitman. He framed it casually at first, as though it were a harmless comparison. Andrew, the son of his business partner, was doing well for himself. Educated, established, dependable. A good family. A reasonable future. Evelyn seized on the idea almost with relief, expanding on it as if the solution had been there all along. Lily and Andrew already knew each other, after all. They moved in the same circles. Why Lily would overlook someone so suitable in favor of a man like Dan made no sense to them. That was when Lily's composure finally broke. She stood up so abruptly that her chair scraped loudly against the floor. Her voice rose, no longer careful or measured. This was not infatuation, she said, not a passing feeling. She was not confused, naive, or blinded by romance. She loved Dan with a certainty she had never felt before, a certainty that reached far beyond convenience or comfort. She was choosing him for life, not for appearances, not for approval. Evelyn tried to speak again, but Lily could no longer listen. The room felt smaller with every word, the walls closing in with expectations she could not accept. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall there, under that roof, in front of people who reduced her love to a mistake waiting to happen. She grabbed her coat and stormed out of the house, the door closing behind her with a finality that startled even her. Outside, the cold Boston air hit her face, sharp and grounding. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone, her heart racing with hurt, anger, and resolve all at once. Lily didn't hesitate. She called Dan and asked him to meet her immediately. Dan arrived quickly, breathless from the cold and from worry, and when Lily saw him standing under the streetlight, she felt the tension in her chest loosen for the first time that night. She didn't explain everything at once. She didn't have to. One look at her face told him enough. Without asking where else she might go, Dan made a decision that felt natural and inevitable. He took her with him. His grandmother's apartment was in an older Boston building, solid and unpretentious, the kind of place that had been standing long before trends came and went. Dan hesitated briefly at the door, not because he doubted the welcome, but because he knew how much this moment would matter. Margaret Carter did not tolerate disorder lightly, especially not the kind that came wrapped in emotion. Margaret was a retired school principal, a woman who had spent her life commanding respect without ever raising her voice. Her posture was straight despite her age, her hair neatly arranged, her eyes sharp and observant. When Dan introduced Lily, Margaret studied her carefully, not with suspicion, but with a calm intensity that made Lily feel as though she were being measured on something far deeper than appearances. They sat at the kitchen table, tea poured, the clock ticking softly on the wall. Dan explained what had happened in careful, respectful sentences. Lily added what she could, her voice steady but quiet. Margaret listened without interruption. She asked a few questions, precise and practical, then fell silent again, considering everything she had heard. Dan had been raised in this apartment. When he was barely old enough to remember anything clearly, his parents had been killed in a car accident, leaving Margaret to raise her grandson alone. She had been younger then, still working, still full of relentless discipline. Dan had grown up under her watchful eye, learning responsibility early, learning that life rarely offered easy paths. When Margaret finally spoke, her tone was calm, almost gentle. She said she would not turn Lily away. No one, she believed, should be left without a place to stand when the ground beneath them gave way. But she also made herself very clear. In her home, a man and a woman did not live together as husband and wife unless they were married. It was not a matter for negotiation or debate. It was simply how she lived and how she expected her household to be run. Lily did not argue. She did not even hesitate. She nodded and said she understood. She would stay in a separate room. It was said so simply that Margaret looked at her again, this time with something like approval flickering in her eyes. The arrangement was set without drama. Lily moved into the small spare bedroom, placing her few belongings carefully as though she were a guest, determined not to impose. Dan showed her where everything was, trying to lighten the moment with quiet jokes that didn't quite land. Beneath his calm exterior, his thoughts were already racing. Life in the apartment settled into an uneasy but peaceful routine. Mornings were quiet. Margaret kept her habits, rising early, reading the newspaper, maintaining order without comment. Lily adjusted quickly, helping where she could, careful not to overstep. There were no raised voices, no confrontations, only a sense of restraint, as though everyone were aware they were balancing on something fragile. Lily threw herself into preparing for graduation, finalizing paperwork, meeting deadlines. In the evenings, she searched for work, sending out applications, determined not to be a burden. She spoke of the future with cautious hope, imagining a life built slowly but honestly. Dan watched her and felt pride mixed with a growing knot of fear. He loved her more each day, yet the weight of his situation pressed harder on his chest. He had no savings, no ring, no clear plan. Living under his grandmother's roof with the woman he intended to marry only sharpened his sense of responsibility. Every quiet dinner, every careful boundary, reminded him of what he could not yet provide. Outwardly, things were calm. Inwardly, Dan's anxiety was beginning to take shape, silently preparing him for a choice that would soon change everything. Dan's unease grew quietly, day by day, until it became impossible to ignore. It showed in the way he lingered after dinner, staring at nothing, or in the way he avoided Lily's eyes when the future came up in conversation. He loved her deeply, but that love only sharpened his sense of failure. He had no money set aside, no ring, no place of his own where he could bring her as his wife. Every morning he woke up under his grandmother's roof, reminded him that he was not yet the man he believed Lily deserved. The idea of a courthouse marriage crossed his mind more than once. It would be quick, inexpensive, practical, but each time the thought surfaced, it left behind a bitter aftertaste. Dan imagined standing before Lily's parents, imagined the looks he would receive, the unspoken judgments that would follow him for the rest of his life. Worse than that was the judgment he felt from himself. He did not want to begin his marriage with apologies or explanations. He wanted to stand upright, unashamed, able to say that he had provided something real. Lily noticed the tension, of course. She always did. She tried to ease it in the only way she knew how. She spoke gently about simplicity, about how little she truly needed. She said rings could wait, that a celebration could be modest, that work was something they could face together. She was willing to take any job, to build a life piece by piece. To her, love was already enough. But Dan shook his head every time, not because he doubted her sincerity, but because he feared accepting it. He could not bear the thought that Lily might one day look back and feel she had settled for less because of him. The suggestion came unexpectedly. During a brief conversation with a former colleague, he ran into near the docks. The man spoke of seasonal work aboard a commercial vessel operating out of Maine. It was hard labor, he said, physically exhausting and unforgiving. The hours were long, the conditions harsh. But the pay was good, better than anything Dan could hope to earn locally in the same amount of time. 1 year, the man said. 1 year of work. And Dan could come back with real savings. Enough for a proper wedding. Enough to start over without shame. The idea lodged itself in Dan's mind and refused to leave. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muted sounds of the apartment. He thought about Lily in the next room, asleep and unaware of the storm gathering inside him. He thought about the distance, the danger, the possibility of losing her not to another man, but to time and absence. The thought of leaving her behind felt like tearing something essential out of his chest. When he finally spoke to Lily about it, she reacted exactly as he had feared. She tried to talk him out of it, her voice trembling with a mixture of worry and disbelief. She said they could manage without such drastic measures. She said a year was too long, that anything could happen in that time. She begged him to reconsider. Dan listened, and it hurt him more than he could say. But his resolve only hardened. He could not ignore the chance to change their circumstances, not when it was finally within reach. He told her he would rather endure a year of separation than a lifetime of regret. Margaret, who had been listening from a careful distance, surprised Lily by siding with Dan. She did not dramatize the situation or offer comfort she did not believe in. She spoke plainly. She said that Dan's choice was not reckless but serious. Painful, yes, but rooted in responsibility. She understood what it meant for a man to feel the weight of providing for those he loved. Her quiet approval settled something inside Dan. It did not make the decision easier, but it made it final. In the days that followed, Dan began making inquiries, gathering information, preparing himself for what lay ahead. Each step forward felt heavy, but also strangely clarifying. There was no turning back now. He would go to sea, not because he wanted to leave, but because he believed that was the only way he could return worthy of the life he hoped to build. For Dan, the choice marked the moment when love turned into sacrifice, and when the path ahead became irrevocably set. The farewell came quietly, without ceremony or witnesses beyond the three of them. There was no gathering of friends, no speeches, no symbolic gestures meant to soften the moment. Dan packed a single bag, careful not to linger over his things, as though moving too slowly might weaken his resolve. Lily watched from the doorway, her hands clasped together so tightly that her fingers ached, determined not to give in to tears while he was still there. They spoke little. Everything important had already been said, argued, and accepted. Dan held Lily for a long moment, his arms firm around her, as if he were trying to memorize the weight of her presence. He told her again that he would come back, that this separation had a purpose, that when he returned he would do everything properly. No borrowed compromises, no half measures. They would marry, start a real life, and leave this painful chapter behind them. Lily nodded, forcing a small smile. She told him she believed him. She told him she would wait. Her voice held steady, even when her heart threatened to break apart inside her chest. Margaret stood nearby, silent and composed, offering neither reassurance nor warning. She knew this was something Dan had to do alone. When the door finally closed behind him, the sound echoed through the apartment with an emptiness that seemed far louder than it should have been. Lily stood still for several seconds, staring at the closed door as if expecting it to open again. Then, without warning, her strength gave way. She sank into a chair, her body folding inward as sobs broke free, violent and uncontrollable. Margaret did not rush to her immediately. She waited, allowing the storm to pass as best it could, then brought Lily a glass of water and sat across from her. There were no speeches, no attempts to frame the pain as noble or necessary. Margaret simply stayed, her presence steady, her silence offering what comfort it could. Life after Dan's departure took on a strange, muted rhythm. The apartment felt larger and quieter, filled with spaces that seemed to exist only to remind Lily of what was missing. She and Margaret continued living together, moving carefully around one another, bound now by shared concern and a fragile sense of responsibility. At first, Lily tried to maintain her routines. She attended classes, worked on her final projects, and kept searching for employment. But the strain began to show. Her appetite faded. Sleep came in broken stretches, interrupted by anxious thoughts and sudden waves of grief. She grew pale, her energy draining away day by day. Margaret noticed, of course. She urged Lily to eat, to rest, to step outside for fresh air. Lily complied outwardly, unwilling to cause worry, but the effort of pretending to be fine exhausted her even more. Without Dan, everything felt provisional, suspended, as though her life were paused until his return. The weekly phone calls became Lily's only true anchor. They were scheduled, brief and precious. She counted down the days and hours until each one, marking time by their approach. When Dan's voice finally came through the line, distant but familiar, she felt momentarily whole again. During those calls, Lily tried to sound cheerful. She spoke about small, ordinary things, careful not to burden Dan with her fear or loneliness. Dan, in turn, spoke sparingly about his work, not wanting to worry her with details of hardship or danger. Each conversation ended too quickly, leaving Lily clutching the phone long after the line went dead. When the call ended, the emptiness returned with renewed force. Lily would sit in silence, staring at the wall, replaying Dan's words in her mind as if they might sustain her until the next Friday. The dread she carried was subtle but constant, a quiet fear that crept in during the long stretches of waiting. Separation had settled over her life like a shadow. Love, once a source of strength, had become something she clung to desperately, afraid that letting go, even for a moment, might mean losing everything. Margaret noticed the changes before Lily said a word. It was not only the weight loss, though that alone would have been concerning. Lily's face had grown drawn, her movements slower, as if every step required more effort than the last. There were moments when she had to steady herself against the counter or pause midway through a sentence, her breath shallow and uneven. One morning, When Lily nearly fainted while standing in the kitchen, Margaret made her decision. This was no longer something that could be dismissed as nerves or heartbreak. Margaret told Lily firmly that she would see a doctor. Not later, not when she felt ready. Immediately, Lily tried to protest, weakly at first, then with quiet insistence. She said she was just tired, that it was stress, that everything would settle once she finished school. Margaret listened, then shook her head. Years of responsibility had taught her the difference between excuses and danger. She reminded Lily that denial had never solved anything. Lily finally agreed, more out of exhaustion than conviction. The appointment was arranged quickly. The clinic was familiar to Margaret, a place she trusted. Lily sat on the examination table, her hands folded in her lap, her thoughts drifting uneasily between guilt and fear. She had no clear sense of what was wrong, only a growing awareness that something inside her had been quietly changing. The results came sooner than Lily expected. The doctor spoke calmly, professionally, explaining the findings step by step. Lily heard the words, as if from a distance, struggling to connect them to herself. Nearly 3 months pregnant. The phrase repeated in her mind, unreal and overwhelming. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt, and she gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. Shock came first, sharp and disorienting. Then fear followed, close behind. Fear of what this meant, of what lay ahead, of what Dan would think. And beneath it all, fragile and trembling, was joy. A life. His life. Something of Dan that had been growing inside her all this time. Unseen and unacknowledged, Margaret absorbed the news in silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, but her eyes softened. She asked practical questions, took notes, scheduled follow-up visits. Only later, when they were alone again, did she allow herself a moment to sit down and breathe. This changed everything. Lily barely slept that night. She lay awake, one hand resting instinctively on her stomach, her thoughts racing ahead in conflicting directions. She imagined Dan's face when she told him, his surprise, his happiness, or his worry. Would the news make his work harder, knowing what he was missing? Would it burden him, distract him, or give him strength? She went back and forth endlessly. Part of her wanted to tell him immediately, to hear his voice, to share the secret that now defined her life. Another part feared the timing. He was far away, working under difficult conditions. She did not want to add to his stress or leave him feeling helpless. In the end, Lily chose compromise. She would tell him during their next scheduled Friday call. That way, she could prepare herself, choose her words carefully, make the moment as calm and reassuring as possible. She told herself it was only a matter of days. She could wait that long. The days passed slowly, each one stretching further than the last. Lily began taking better care of herself, eating when she could, resting more often. Margaret watched her closely, offering support without smothering her. Together, they spoke cautiously of the future, avoiding assumptions, holding on to hope without giving it too much room to hurt them. Friday finally arrived. Lily prepared for the call with unusual care. She brushed her hair, chose clean, comfortable clothes, and sat at the table where she always waited. Her heart beat faster with every passing minute. This time the call would change everything. The hour came and went. There was no ringing, no familiar voice on the line. At first, Lily told herself it was nothing. Delays happened. Schedules shifted. She waited another 15 minutes, then another. Each moment of silence tightened the knot in her chest. She checked the phone again and again, willing it to come alive in her hands. But the phone remained silent. By the end of the evening, Lily understood that something was wrong. The happiness she had been holding so carefully slipped into suspension, hovering between hope and fear. The future she had imagined only hours earlier suddenly felt distant and uncertain, as if it had been paused mid-breath, waiting for a call that never came. The silence stretched from hours into days, and with each one, Lily's sense of unease deepened. At first, she tried to reason with herself. Communications at sea were unreliable. Schedules shifted. Equipment failed. Dan had missed calls before. Rarely, but it had happened. She repeated these thoughts like a prayer, clinging to them as a way to steady her breathing. By the third day, the calm explanations no longer held. Lily barely slept. She jumped at every sound, checked her phone obsessively, and replayed their last conversation again and again, searching for signs she might have missed. Margaret watched her closely, growing more concerned by the hour. Lily's hands trembled constantly now. Her face had gone ashen, her eyes hollowed by fear and exhaustion. Food went untouched. Water made her nauseous. On the fifth morning, the knock came. It was firm but hesitant, as though the person on the other side did not want to be there, but had no choice. Margaret opened the door. A woman stood on the threshold. Her coat, still damp from the cold air outside, her face pale and strained. She introduced herself haltingly as the wife of one of Dan's coworkers. Her voice wavered as she asked if this was Daniel Carter's address. Lily had already risen from her chair. She stood frozen a few steps away, listening. The woman explained that there had been an accident. A violent storm had swept through the waters off the coast of Maine days earlier, far more severe than forecast. The vessel Dan had been working on had suffered significant damage. Rescue operations had been launched immediately, involving the Coast Guard and nearby ships. But the conditions had been brutal. Waves, wind, darkness, everything working against them. Some crew members had been pulled from the water. Others had not. The words fell into the room slowly, each one heavier than the last. Lily felt the floor sway beneath her feet, though she had not moved. She heard the woman say that Dan's name was not on the list of survivors. She heard Margaret ask careful questions about timing, about confirmation, about what presumed meant in this context. The woman answered as best she could, tears slipping down her cheeks. No body had been recovered. There were no remains to identify. But after days of searching, hope was fading. Lily tried to speak. She tried to ask something, anything, but no sound came out. The room narrowed, the edges blurring, as a sharp pressure closed around her chest. She took a step forward, then another, and then her legs simply gave out beneath her. Margaret caught her before she hit the floor, calling her name in a voice Lily could barely hear. The world tilted violently, then went dark. Lily woke to bright lights and unfamiliar sounds. Her head throbbed. Her mouth was dry. For a moment, she could not remember where she was or why her body felt so heavy. Then the memories rushed back all at once. The phone that never rang. The woman at the door. The word storm echoing endlessly in her mind. She tried to sit up, panic flaring, but firm hands pressed her gently back down. A nurse spoke calmly, explaining that Lily was in the hospital. She had collapsed from severe stress and dehydration. Her blood pressure had dropped dangerously low. The pregnancy complicated everything. Doctors moved quickly, monitoring Lily's vitals and the baby's condition with equal urgency. For fluids were started. Tests were run. The atmosphere in the room was controlled, but tense, the kind of focus reserved for situations that could still tip in either direction. Margaret stood nearby, her face composed but drawn tight with worry. She spoke with the doctors, asked questions, absorbed information without comment. Only when she was alone for a brief moment did she allow herself to sit down, her hands shaking slightly as the reality of what might have been lost pressed in. For Lily, time dissolved into fragments, voices drifting in and out, the rhythmic beeping of machines, the pressure of someone checking her pulse. At one point, she reached for her stomach instinctively, a surge of terror cutting through the fog. A doctor reassured her quietly that the baby was still alive, but that both of them were at risk if her condition did not stabilize. They fought through the night. By morning, Lily's condition had improved enough that the immediate danger had passed, though she remained under close observation. Physically, she was still weak. Emotionally, she felt hollowed out, as if something essential had been torn from her without warning or explanation. Dan was gone, or lost somewhere between life and death, suspended in a space where no answers existed. There was no goodbye, no confirmation, only absence. As Lily stared at the ceiling, tears sliding silently into her hair, the future she had been holding so carefully finally shattered. What remained was not certainty or grief, but a terrible, unanswered question, and the unbearable weight of loving someone who had vanished without leaving even a body behind. Lily survived. That fact alone felt unreal in the weeks that followed, as though her body had endured something her mind could barely comprehend. The doctors monitored her closely, unwilling to take risks after what she had been through. The pregnancy held, fragile but steady, and that fragile certainty became the only reason Lily forced herself to keep moving forward. She carried the child through the remaining months with a quiet determination that surprised even Margaret. Lily spoke little about the future. She focused instead on what could be measured. Appointments kept, instructions followed, days counted one by one. When the time came, she gave birth to a boy. She named him Samuel Carter. Samuel's arrival brought no sudden healing, no dramatic shift in Lily's grief. If anything, it sharpened it. She held her son close and felt both love and loss intertwine in a way that left her breathless. Dan should have been there. Dan should have seen this. The thought followed her everywhere, persistent and inescapable. After leaving the hospital, Lily made her decision quickly and without hesitation. She would not return to her parents' home. The idea felt wrong, almost unbearable. Instead, she went back to Margaret's apartment, to the place that still carried Dan's presence in 1,000 small, painful ways. Margaret welcomed her without question. She prepared a small space for the baby and adjusted her routines once again, practical and steady as ever. Evelyn did not accept Lily's choice quietly. At first, the conversations were strained but controlled. Evelyn called often, offering help that felt less like concern and more like insistence. She suggested Lily needed rest, support, a proper environment. She reminded her daughter of how difficult single motherhood would be, especially without certainty about Dan's fate. As weeks passed, the tone hardened. Evelyn began to speak openly about moving on. She said Lily was young, that life did not end because of tragedy. She argued that clinging to the past would only harm Samuel in the long run. Each word struck Lily like a blow, not because Evelyn was entirely wrong, but because she spoke as if Dan were already gone in the most final sense. The confrontation came one afternoon when Evelyn arrived unannounced. Samuel slept in the next room as the argument unfolded, voices rising despite Lily's efforts to keep them low. Evelyn accused her daughter of hiding behind grief, of refusing to face reality. She suggested, too bluntly, that without a body, without proof, Lily was choosing an illusion over life itself. Something inside Lily broke. She told her mother to stop. When Evelyn didn't, Lily said things she had been holding back for months. She spoke of love, of loyalty, of what it meant to stand by someone even when the world declared it unreasonable. She said she would not erase Dan simply because it made others uncomfortable. She said she would not teach her son that love was disposable. Evelyn tried to answer, but Lily cut her off. She told her mother not to come back, not until she could respect Lily's choices and her grief, not until she could speak of Dan without dismissing him as a mistake or an obstacle. The door closed with a finality that echoed painfully through the apartment. After that, Lily's world narrowed. She lived quietly, almost invisibly, focused on Samuel and the small routines that gave her day's structure. She fed him, rocked him, spoke to him softly as though Dan might hear through the walls. At night, when the apartment was still, she allowed herself to grieve fully, tears soaking into the pillow as she whispered things she would never say aloud during the day. There was no grave to visit, no place to mourn properly. Dan existed everywhere and nowhere at once, alive in memory and absent in every way that mattered. Lily carried him with her constantly, a presence as real as her son in her arms. In her heart, Lily lived as a widow, not because death had been confirmed, but because love had not let go, far from Boston, far from the life he had known. Daniel Carter was still alive, though nothing about his existence resembled living in any meaningful sense. The sea had not taken his body, but had stripped him of everything else. He was found after the storm, half-conscious and barely breathing, washed ashore along a remote stretch of coastline in Maine. How long he had been in the water, no one could say with certainty. By the time a local man noticed him and dragged him onto dry ground, his body was battered, his mind empty. He survived by chance, by timing, by the stubborn refusal of his body to give up. But when he opened his eyes days later, there was nothing waiting for him inside his own head. No name, no memories, no past. The people who took him in lived far from towns and hospitals, part of a small, isolated rural community tucked deep inland, where everyone knew one another and strangers were rare. They brought him to a modest house, fed him, treated his injuries as best they could, and waited for his memory to return. It never did. When he failed to recall even his own name, they gave him one. Someone suggested Connor, and it stuck not because it fit, but because something had to fill the silence. Connor became the name he answered to, though it felt foreign in his mouth, like a borrowed coat that never quite sat right on his shoulders. He stayed because he had nowhere else to go. Without documents, without memories, without even a vague sense of who he had once been, Connor became useful in the only way he could. He worked. He hauled, repaired, lifted, and carried. He accepted food and a place to sleep in exchange for his labor, never asking questions, never demanding more. The arrangement was unspoken, but clear. He was alive because he was needed, and needed because he could work. At night, when exhaustion pulled him into sleep, fragments began to surface, dreams without context. A woman's face he could never see clearly. A voice saying his name, though he did not know what that name was. A feeling of urgency, of love, of loss, all tangled together without meaning. He woke from these dreams disoriented and shaken, his heart pounding, his head aching as if he had tried to remember something forbidden. The harder he focused, the worse it became. A sharp ringing filled his ears. His vision blurred. Eventually, he learned not to push too far, but something inside him refused to stay silent. Not far from the settlement lay a small cemetery, old and weathered, its stones worn smooth by time and neglect. Connor found himself walking there without understanding why. At first, he told himself it was coincidence, that he simply enjoyed the quiet. But the pull returned again and again, persistent and inexplicable. He wandered among the headstones slowly, reading names he did not recognize, dates that meant nothing to him. Still, he felt as though he was searching for something specific, something just beyond reach. Occasionally, a name would cause his chest to tighten, or a date would send a flicker of pain through his skull, but the connection never fully formed. The locals noticed his habit and warned him off gently. Cemeteries, they said, were places for the dead. There was no reason for him to linger there. Connor nodded, agreed, and returned anyway the next chance he got. His days passed in a dull repetition. Wake, work, eat, sleep. Nothing marked the passage of time except the slow change of seasons. He did not age forward or backward. He simply existed, suspended between what had been and what might never come. He did not know that somewhere else a woman mourned him. He did not know that he had a son. He did not know that his name was carved into stone. What he knew, what he felt, Deep beneath the silence was that something essential had been taken from him. His life was paused, incomplete, as if the world had pressed a hand against his chest and said, "Not yet." And so Connor walked, worked, and dreamed, a man without a name, waiting for a memory strong enough to break through the fog and call him back to himself. Lily traveled alone. She left Samuel with Margaret, packing only what she needed for a short journey, telling herself this was not an escape but a necessity. For nearly a year, her grief had circled the same unanswered question. Now it pulled her north, toward the place where Dan had last been seen alive or lost. The coastal town was small and quiet, shaped by the sea and by loss. The harbor smelled of salt and cold wind. Fishing boats moved slowly in the distance, their outlines blurred by mist. Nothing about the place felt dramatic. If anything, it was ordinary in a way that made Lily's chest ache. This was where lives continued, even after tragedy. She found the memorial on the edge of an old cemetery overlooking the water. It was a simple stone, weathered but carefully maintained, with names carved into its surface in neat lines. Men who had gone out to sea and never come back. Lily stood still for a long moment before stepping closer. Bracing herself, she found his name, Daniel Carter. The letters were clean and permanent, as though they had always been there. Lily reached out, her fingers hovering just above the stone, unable to touch it at first. Her breathing grew uneven. This was the only place in the world where she was allowed to grieve him openly, where her love did not need justification. Believing she was alone, Lily lowered herself to the ground beside the memorial. The cold seeped through her coat, but she didn't move. She pressed her palm flat against the stone and finally allowed herself to speak. She told Dan she had come because she could not live with the silence anymore. She told him about Samuel, about his dark hair, about the way he frowned when he slept, about the sound of his laugh when Margaret bounced him on her knee. She told him their son was strong, that he was healthy, that he looked like him. Her voice broke when she said Dan's name again. She said she had waited, that she was still waiting, that even now, part of her believed he was somewhere out there, lost but alive, just as she was lost without him. She asked him what she was supposed to do next, how to live a life that felt unfinished in every direction. She did not see the man standing several yards away, partially hidden by a stand of bare trees. He had come to the cemetery, as he often did, drawn there by the same unexplainable pull. He had intended only to pass through, to read names he did not understand and leave before the familiar pressure built in his head. But then he heard her voice. The sound struck him like a blow. It was not the words at first, but the tone, intimate, broken, unmistakably familiar. His chest tightened sharply and the world tilted. The air seemed to rush out of his lungs as memories surged forward without warning. A face, a laugh, a warmth he had carried for years without knowing why. His head throbbed violently, pain blooming behind his eyes as images forced themselves into place. A life, a home, a promise, the name on the stone, Daniel Carter. He took a step forward before he realized he was moving. His legs felt unsteady, his heart racing as if it might tear itself apart. Lily was still speaking, her back to him, her words dissolving into quiet sobs. He heard her say his name again, Lily. The word tore itself from his throat before he could stop it. Lily froze. For a split second, her mind rejected the sound entirely. Then she turned slowly, as if afraid that moving too fast might shatter whatever illusion her grief had created. Her eyes found him standing there, pale and shaking, staring at her as though he were seeing the world for the first time. The ground seemed to vanish beneath her feet. She tried to stand, failed, and collapsed back onto the cold earth. He reached her in 2 unsteady steps, dropping to his knees beside her. His hands hovered, unsure, afraid to touch her in case she disappeared. Recognition hit them both at once. Lily reached for him, her fingers gripping his jacket with desperate strength, as though anchoring him to reality. He wrapped his arms around her instinctively, holding her as memories slammed fully into place. The storm, the water, the lost year, and now her. "I remember," he said hoarsely, his voice breaking. "Lily, I remember everything." She sobbed into his chest, her body shaking as if the grief she had carried for so long were finally being released. Around them, the cemetery remained still and indifferent, the sea continuing its endless motion beyond the hill. Dan knew who he was. He knew who she was. And in that moment, the life that had been suspended between loss and silence came crashing back into being. The return to Boston felt unreal, as though Lily and Dan were moving through a world that had not yet caught up with what had happened to them. They traveled quietly, side by side, Lily's hand never leaving Dan's, as if she feared that letting go, even for a moment, might undo everything. Dan looked out the window as the city came into view, seeing familiar streets with the eyes of someone who had been absent from his own life for far too long. Margaret was waiting. When the door opened and she saw him standing there, thinner, changed, but unmistakably her grandson, she did not speak at first. She simply stared, her composure finally breaking as tears filled her eyes. Dan stepped forward, and she reached for him with a strength that surprised them both, holding him as if to make certain he was real. Years of discipline and restraint dissolved in that embrace. For a long moment, there were no words, only relief. The meeting with Samuel came next. Dan approached the crib slowly, almost fearfully, as though he were stepping into something sacred. The baby looked up at him with calm curiosity, unaware of the weight of the moment. Lily watched as Dan knelt beside the crib, his breath catching when Samuel's small fingers wrapped instinctively around his own. Dan's shoulders shook as he bent his head, overcome by a love he had been denied for nearly a year. "I'm here," he whispered, more promise than statement. The practical matters followed, unavoidable but necessary. Dan was legally restored to the world that had declared him lost. Records were corrected. His identity was confirmed. What had once been considered a closed chapter was reopened with quiet efficiency. Each signature and document felt surreal, a reminder of how easily a life could be erased and returned. Lily's parents came reluctantly at first, unsure of what they would find. When they saw Dan alive, standing before them, there was no room left for denial. The truth dismantled their assumptions in an instant. The man they had dismissed as unworthy had survived, endured, and come back, not diminished, but proven. There were apologies, awkward, imperfect, but sincere enough to matter. Lily listened without triumph or resentment. What mattered now was not vindication, but clarity. Love, she realized, did not need permission to be real. The wedding took place quietly, without spectacle or excess. It did not need any of that. When Lily stood beside Dan and spoke her vows, her voice steady and sure, she felt no fear. When Dan promised his life to her, he did so without shame or hesitation. They were not beginning something new, so much as completing something that had already survived its hardest test. In the days that followed, life did not suddenly become easy. Healing never worked that way, but it became honest. Lily and Dan faced the future together, grounded not in comfort or certainty, but in what they had already endured. They had learned that love was not proven by wealth, status, or safety. It was proven by waiting, by choosing, by remaining faithful even when the world offered no reassurance in return. Margaret watched them with quiet pride, holding Samuel in her arms, understanding that some lessons could only be learned through loss. For those listening, this story leaves behind more than relief. It invites reflection on patience when the waiting feels unbearable, on dignity when love is questioned or judged, and on the danger of measuring a life by its surface rather than its depth. If this story resonated with you, consider what endurance has looked like in your own life. What or who has been worth waiting for? And how often quiet resilience speaks louder than certainty ever could. We invite you to share your thoughts on love, loss, and second chances.